Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Taking Control of Your Diabetes podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jeremy Pettis, and I am not joined today by my co-host, Dr. Steve Edelman, who is in Europe actually at a diabetes meeting. I'm actually, though, physically sitting in his chair. Do not tell him in his office. When he gets back, he might notice some crumbs and things around here. But anyways, I'm joined by a very special guest, Laura Dunn. Say hi, Laura.
Hello.
And Laura is here because it's Mother's Day week. And we wanted to use the theme of Mother's Day to talk about a mom who's living with type 1 diabetes, who has a son that's semi-recently, now 2 years ago, been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and all the kind of things to talk about in there. You know, what it's like to be living as a mom with type 1, what it's like to have, a child now with type 1. So I just want to start with saying, a little bit about who you are. Tell us when you were diagnosed with type 1. Let's get into your story first.
Yeah, thanks. Excited to be here and share a little bit about my story of myself, my diabetes family, because my husband also has type 1 diabetes too. And then, our son Mason, who's 6.5, he will correct me if I don't say and a half. One of those things that you learn as a mom.
Well, I always remember because I have a son that's like pretty much the exact same age,
yeah.
So that's another thing that your story really kind of rings true with me. But all right, go on.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good. So do you want to know
Well, just tell us that, how old were you when you were diagnosed?
Yeah, sure. So I was diagnosed back in the late 80s when I had just turned 4 years old. But leading up to that, there was a lot of constant thirst, constant craving sugar.
You remember this?
I have vague memories of craving sugar from the sugar bowl. If you remember, when there actually had sugar bowls on the table,
Totally.
I would sneak sugar,
just straight to the source.
straight sugar, straight from the bowl when no one was looking. And of course, as a kid, you don't think that's weird, but obviously that's not normal.
Mm-hmm.
And then my mom, who is a dietitian, she started noticing some of these weird things. I had been potty trained, but I had started wetting the bed again. And my grandfather, actually on my dad's side, had type 1 diabetes. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of in her family. So she had some signals.
Your grandfather on your dad's side?
On my dad's side, okay. Yeah. So a lot of diabetes in my family. Okay. She had noticed some signals, right? And so because my grandfather had type 1 diabetes, we had a test kit that was accessible to us. So luckily, when I was diagnosed, they had strips, and you didn't have to do the urine boiling and pills and whatnot, and craziness.
I know when I hear Steve talk about that, it just seems like it's just another world. But
dinosaur
I never
age.
had to do it. Yeah,
no kidding. So she checked my blood sugar, and I don't actually know the number, but it was of course through the roof. So we went to dinner, and I listened to your actual story on your podcast. I was given Diet Pepsi instead of the real deal.
That's good.
And then went straight into the hospital. And, as a kid, I was really shy about having type 1 diabetes. I didn't like talking about it with friends. It was this big, dark secret.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing I probably at the time, as an adult looking back, I had a lot of shame around it because I didn't want to be different.
Yeah.
And so until I went to diabetes camp later on, it was held real close, and no one really knew about it.
And what was it like with your parents? What was that interaction around your diabetes?
It was tough because I think, being diagnosed at such a young age, you don't understand what's going on. So suddenly your parents who have never really intentionally hurt you in your life are stabbing you with a needle, and you don't get it. So, there are stories of me being really, really upset, and my mom having to, me saying I don't want any more shots, or I don't want any more finger pokes, and her having to say we're done for today, you know, and just being honest with me. And I think looking back on it and now being, having a child of my own with diabetes and having similar conversations about site changes and things like that, it's hard.
And do you have brothers or sisters?
I have a brother. He does not have diabetes.
Okay.
Though, but yeah, brother.
So what was that like? Did you feel like your relationship with your parents was different than his?
There was a lot of attention around me having diabetes, and it was a
negative way.
In a way that I didn't want.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be the center of attention. And so I think that's probably too another reason why I didn't like sharing it, is because there was a lot of focus around like, my mom being a dietitian. And, we'll probably get to this later, but like, I think a lot of the choices that she made and that my medical team made when I was a kid have really shaped how I parent my son Mason now. So for example, because she was a dietitian, I never saw a dietitian because the theory was like, well, I saw my dietitian every day.
Okay.
My dietitian is my mom. And I'm like in the back of my head, I don't think that was the best decision because like my mom should have been my mom and I should have seen a dietitian.
Have you talked to your brother about this? Like growing up?
A little bit. My brother's not like
very verbose about this.
Yeah.
What about your grandfather that has type 1? Are you close to him or were you?
I was. Yeah. We definitely had a special bond and, he's now passed, but especially I think being older, I was in my young 20s when he passed, like really wishing I had dug more into, his experience and his background of living with it, especially in like the 50s and 60s and all of that. That's like a big miss on my part.
Do you think that maybe you were his favorite because you had type 1? Or?
Well, I was the oldest.
Okay.
So I was the favorite of everybody.
But it must have bonded you. You know?
We definitely bonded. I think there were other reasons too. Like my grandfather was an engineer, and I've always really been inclined to like build things and very hands-on. So like we bonded outside of diabetes, but that definitely was something that.
What about? Do you ever feel like there was any inkling in your family that your dad or your dad's side gave this to you?
Don't know that it was like they gave it to me. I think it was always understood that it was just
do you feel like there's any guilt from your dad or like side of the family that this landed on you?
Not guilt. I think a lot of anxiety about me having it and about high and low blood sugars and like what I could eat and couldn't eat. And, some of the focus and attention, you too, like there weren't pumps when I was growing up. Right. So you were really regimented with regular insulin and NPH. So like you had to eat around the clock. I could never sleep in. So it was really.
But there's never your mom yelling at your dad.
Like, nah, I don't think so.
Okay, good.
Not that I remember.
Checking
no. Yelling about other things, but not that.
Yeah. All right. So, I can relate for sure with the regular and NPH period or whatever. So then, you go through like your early adulthood. And let's talk about a little bit about you meeting your husband, because that's definitely another interesting piece of this puzzle that he has type 1 himself. So how did you guys meet? How did you know that he had type 1? Tell us that story a little bit.
Yeah, so at the time I was working in a clinical trial, or let me re-say that, at a diabetes clinic running clinical trials. And so I was a study coordinator and was recruiting people for an insulin pump study. And so I was on my lunch break with a friend, and I was showing her my insulin pump and talking about it. And he walks by and was like, "Hey, what's that? Like, I have diabetes." And he was thinking about getting a pump. And so I was trying to recruit him for the study.
So he just literally was at this lunch
was at a Quiznos.
Quiznos.
Yeah.
Okay, that's better. I'm thinking some hoity-toity steak restaurant. No. This is a Quiznos. Okay,
I was like
that's the steam.
23.
Okay.
No. So yeah, I gave him my card, and he was actually.
You had a card at 23.
I did have a card. I was like super businesswoman wannabe back then.
And had your home phone number on it with your answering machine.
My cell phone. I had a cell phone back then. I'm not that old. But we actually had an appointment the next week, anyways, to talk about this study.
With him?
With him.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just total coincidence. Okay.
Total coincidence. Match made in heaven, right? So then we're sitting like fast forward a week later at the appointment, we're sitting across from each other, kind of like you and I are now. And I'm like, showing him the insulin pump, and I'm like sweating and turning red and being like, this guy's kind of cute. And then,
because you're nervous or you're low or.
No, because he was cute.
Okay. Just regular, normal stuff.
Regular flirting. Okay. Diabetes is only there in the fact that we're talking about insulin pumps. And so because he had my card that had my cell phone, instead of calling my office about the study, he decided to, call my cell phone and ask me out on a date, and the rest there is history.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, all right. So then you guys get together. That's a super cute meet. I love it. And then eventually you start having the conversation around, should we have kids? And what was that like, knowing that, if you're just a mom with type 1 and you meet somebody that doesn't have diabetes, there's, for the listeners, maybe like a 5% chance or something that the kid will have type 1 diabetes. And that's an important statistic just to mention, that a lot of times I see patients and they'll just kind of assume if they have type 1 that their kids will get it. It's actually fairly rare, 95% chance that they won't. So here you are, you've probably been thinking about that. And then you meet somebody that has type 1, which does increase the risk. So what were those conversations like between the two of you around, one, should we have kids or not, just because do we want kids? And then two, like, what do we think about this chance of them having type 1? Did that even come into the equation at all?
Oh, it did for sure. And I think it might have been at a TCOID conference that I asked Steve about it. Like, hey, like, can you come over here and talk to me on the side? Like, what's the likelihood?
You guys were together at this point and you were talking to him about, should we have kids?
I think Dave and I were married. And so, knowing you and knowing Steve, I actually asked Steve, I'm like, I'm going to go to the, the experts and get the data, get the statistics on how likely this is. But, in the end, I was pretty sure that I wanted kids. So it was more about having the information than it being like a yes or no kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So then tell us, you have one son now, 6.5. And so, we talked about, should we get into the issues around like pregnancy and that, but we want to leave that for maybe another day.
Yeah,
like
that's a whole other episode.
Exactly. And God bless you, especially mothers with type 1 going through that. I mean, pregnancy is tough in general, and then you add diabetes on top of it. But anyways, Mason's born. When did you start thinking about, we'll get to screening, but maybe a little bit around like what I've experienced just with my kids, like anytime they would wet their bed.
Oh, for sure.
Or anytime they're a little bit more thirsty. Is it like, is this regular summertime I'm thirsty, or is this diabetes? So would you check his blood sugar every once in a while, or?
Yes, I did. And I always felt so bad, but you just need to know. And I think like any new mom, you get nervous about everything, whether it's a fever or a rash or, knowing that he had a heightened risk for getting type 1 diabetes. I just put it in the bucket of like all the things that I had anxiety about having a newborn who can't communicate with you. But yeah, I probably did that more than Dave, my husband, looking back on it, just because.
How often do you think you did that in the first like 2 years of his life? Would you check his blood sugar?
Oh, not terribly often, because it's like such a little tiny baby, right? Like maybe once every 3 months or so, if he was like sick or I thought he was, having more wet diapers.
Yeah. Yeah. My son hated it, still hates it. When I would do all these things like, we'll see how powerful you are and what your number is and all this stuff. And he would get behind it, but it hurts.
Yeah.
So it's a traumatic thing. It's not like a, simple thing to check somebody's blood sugar. But anyway, so thankfully, initially blood sugars are normal. And then you start thinking about, should we check his antibodies? And again, for the listeners, there are blood tests that we can do now that will let you know if somebody is at risk of developing type 1 diabetes. And specifically, these are antibodies in the blood. We can check 4 or 5 of them. And if 2 of them come back positive, you have a fairly good chance that this person is going to come down with high blood sugars in the next, couple of years. So because we can do these now, we can offer it to parents to, do you want to know, is your child at risk? So what was your thought around, should I get, Mason tested? What was Dave's thinking? Walk us through those conversations.
Yeah. So, again, at that time, I was still in the clinical trial world. So I was very data driven. And I did waffle back and forth and actually talked to some of my other, mom friends who had kids with diabetes around like, what are they doing? And, kind of like talking through like, is it better to know or is it better to not know? And ultimately, we decided to do it. It seemed like the right and responsible thing to do, for just us having that info. And then, thinking back to the, should I test his blood sugar or not? Once we did get the results back, like it gave me a lot of, it validated my like crazy for wanting to check him. It's like, no, like there's a reason, that we should check him. So I felt less bad about checking him when I had done that in the past.
And when you guys thought about getting his antibodies tested, like what do you think was some of the main reasons why you decided to do it? Was I just want to know where we're at, or is it I'm thinking about maybe a clinical trial for him, or I think that this is an altruistic thing I need to do for the type 1 community?
I think all of it,
Yeah.
right? Like I wanted to give back to the type 1 community for sure. Because there's, and I think I didn't really realize this at the time, but the idea of a clinical trial was really compelling to me. But he was so young when it happened that like those are all off the table. So I did enough research, but I didn't do a thorough job to understand like we tested him when he was like around 2, and he was not going to get anything right with his results.
So you tested him just once, is that right?
We tested him once, and then
when he was 2.
When he was 2.
And how did you do that logistically? Did you go to your doctor? Did you go
we
online?
Went to so we went through the TrialNet website. So we did TrialNet. And then we found a location near us, which was Rady's, so in San Diego. And then we went to them.
Okay. So, we'll talk about this more too, but this has gotten a lot better in terms of like how to get people screened. It used to be kind of like you would have to go and specifically ask and, inquire or be in the know. Now there is a website that people can go to. It's called type1tested.com. And you can learn information about how you can get your child or relative screened. They can actually send you kits to your house now. You can do it at home, or you can go into your doctor's office. So at least this is becoming streamlined. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So, but when you were doing this was a very much of a proactive thing.
Yeah, I was one of those, like, I'm in the know. I worked at Dexcom. Like, I had all the information at my fingertips.
And your pediatrician ordered these for you, or?
I don't think we had to go through the pediatrician,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
Mm-mm.
So then who did it?
I did.
You got it ordered for him?
I contacted, I was like, hey, I have type 1 and my husband has type 1. We want our son tested. And they're like, yeah, cool.
Okay.
From my memory, right?
Okay.
And I'm trying to make sure I'm remembering this correctly, because it was pretty, like, I was picking him up from his daycare and I got a call from the doctor, but the doctor was like on vacation.
Okay.
And he leaves this really like vague voicemail that like he has, results to discuss, but he's
And this is a general like pediatrician, or is this an endocrinologist?
an endocrinologist.
Okay, so this is someone who at least has a context for this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
calls, leaves kind of like that's not good news voicemail.
Yeah.
And then also I'm on vacation and you can't really reach me.
Oh man.
So I panic
Yeah.
because I'm thinking, of course, it's like the worst.
So what did you do?
I contacted the study coordinator. Again,
Okay.
This is like me being in the know, and like my mama bear instincts went in. I'm like, I'm going to figure out what's going on, and I'm going to get the information. And so it was a lot of like very, very heightened anxiety. We finally got, the answers that he had for.
And who gave you those results?
I believe the study coordinator gave me some.
Okay.
And I think what it was is we had some of them back, but not all of them yet, because they kind of come in stages, or at least they did at the time.
This is a he or she? Do you
She.
remember? And
She,
she
the
said
coordinator.
like, hey, Laura, listen, like one of these is positive, or do you even remember? Like,
I think it was like a couple were positive, and we're still waiting on the rest, and we won't know till next week, but like we need to bring him in. Like it was one of those, like, we need to bring in him now. And I'm like, does he have diabetes like right now? Like that's where my heart went. Like it like everything stopped. I was supposed to go on a girls trip that weekend and like go out of town, and I canceled everything because it just was like, I need to be around for whatever this
and I'm
is
sure
going to be.
that all makes a lot of sense, but I'm sure you realize now that nothing had really changed in that moment.
No.
Like these antibodies had been there for some time.
Right.
It identifies risk, but he was at this point fine. His blood sugars were completely normal, right?
I think, yeah, at this point they were completely normal. We went and we did the glucose tolerance test. That's what we did. And there was some like heightened blood sugars after, but like, yeah, he was fine.
So what was that night like? So you get these results, you take him home. I'm guessing you get, like, when do you have the conversation with Dave? Who did you talk to? Like, what were the emotions there?
I mean, Dave was probably in the know throughout the whole timeline of this, but I was fielding a lot of the calls and trying to get all the information. And I have a really good friend of mine who's a nurse practitioner with type 1 diabetes. But she's serves peds in New
Okay.
York. And so she was like my lifeline that
Okay.
entire weekend. Like she talked me off the ledge.
Okay. And again, having these, like, so at this time, there's a couple antibodies positive, you want to see where his glucose is at now, but that he is going to quote unquote get type 1 diabetes. Or did you get your head around that, or what?
That took some time. So the next day when I was back at work, I went and talked to, Dexcom's chief medical officer,
Okay.
VP. And I was again still in that information gathering. Like I want to read the papers. I want to read the medical journals to say like what actually does this mean? What is the risk? And of course, like in reading them, it didn't really help make me feel better because it basically was like he's either gonna like there's a 90% chance he's gonna, and I'm making up these numbers, right?
Yeah.
But like from my memory, it was like really highly likely that by the time he was 5, he was going to be diagnosed. But like definitely by like
And
8 or 10.
He's 2 at this point.
He's 2.
Okay.
Barely over 2.
So obviously getting this information is not good. Like you don't want your child to have type 1 diabetes. So it might be hard to kind of dissect this question, but were you glad to have that information? You're not happy with the diagnosis, but would you rather know than not know?
So in the immediate, I think it was very mixed feelings. Like when I found out, I think I was a little all over the place. Like, do I really want to know this? Do I not want to know this? But once I settled down from those initial emotions, I was glad that I knew. And when he finally was diagnosed, I was really glad that I knew.
Okay. So I want to get to that too. But then how much do you think your reaction to all this was colored by your own life with type 1 diabetes? I mean, it's hard to say, but like, what was your thinking around that? I mean, everything that goes into having type 1 diabetes. I mean, on one side, you're very well equipped to deal with this, but on the other side, how crappy it is to have a low blood sugar and to deal with all this. So how do you balance that? I think that's...
Yeah, I think that comment of like, well, he's going to have the best parents to, guide him through this. Like every time I heard that, I like wanted to pull my hair out. Cause it was so frustrating. And I think like, yes, while I and Dave too have type 1 diabetes, I didn't know how to parent a young child with type 1 diabetes. And that was my fear, especially with him at the time being so young. Like I know my own diabetes and I don't micromanage Dave's. Like we're separate. Like we support each other, right? Like,
right.
In if he's low or high, but like I've never been responsible for another person living with diabetes.
Yeah.
And that was tough to like wrap my head around.
I was saying before this, we recorded this, that, anecdotally, I've heard people that have, they have like, let's say 2 or 3 kids, they have type 1 diabetes, they have 2 or 3 kids. And the kid that gets type 1 diabetes, they kind of will never admit it, but they secretly like that kid better, and I know like he's your one and only, but I'm sure they're, we'll get to this. There's some bonding that comes along with this, and that's got to be this emotional journey from like figuring out the diagnosis to, the bonding piece. So maybe we'll leave that for now.
Okay.
But, so you get the information that he's antibody positive. He will, develop high blood sugars, very likely, in the near future. So when was it? How much longer? So he's 2 when he's antibody positive. When was it that he was officially diagnosed or needed to go on insulin?
It was right before he turned 5. But I will say, like, that whole relationship building. So before, I mean, and granted, he was 2, so he didn't really get it. But like before we found out, we didn't really bring diabetes into the conversation. Right. After we found out that it was going to be high likelihood that he would get it, I would start talking about site changes or sensor readings and just bringing it more into like our normal dialogue to kind of prep for like, this is going to be your reality one day. Right. So I'm not going to hide it from you.
Right.
You need to like see this.
Huge. You know, when we talk about, the benefits of knowing this information, one is really the preparation. And even for somebody like yourself that knows a ton about type 1 diabetes, there's all kinds of preparation for you, for the child. And so, yeah, tell me more about that. Like, what would this be? Like, hey, come help mommy with this, or what do you think about that? Or,
It was really like, it wasn't a come help. It was more like, hey, I'm doing this, like this is just part of what I have to do. And this is part of what daddy has to do. Right.
Mhm.
So, like, not overly focusing on it, but just like bringing it into our everyday
Right.
conversation.
And that just, reminds me that, it's kind of nice in a way that you didn't have to tell him. Like I hear stories about people that get this information when their kids are 8, 10, 11, 12, and it's like, well, do we tell them?
Oh,
When can they understand the
that's tough.
concept of I'm going to develop a disease in the future? And that is really difficult.
Yeah.
At least from your standpoint, is very, very clear. Right? I
Right.
mean,
No,
like,
no.
I could tell him you're going to get type 1 diabetes in 2 years. Like, there's, he doesn't care, or that
Right.
doesn't mean anything to him. But this is a very practical aspect of like, let me, show you my world a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'll just say that my kids, you know, I don't have the same experience, but I do obviously share them, with them what I'm going through and what blood sugars are. And they surprise me every once in a while, like, Daddy's your blood sugar low, or, let me get you this juice or whatever. Cause they obviously are like sponges and they
Mm-hmm.
pick this up. And I think in the back of my head is a little bit like, I want to show them a little bit extra just in case, like, this becomes part of their world. But for you, you had that specific information.
Right.
And so that's the positive, that you can start bringing him into this. Is there a negative in the sense of, like, were you more hyper vigilant of every symptom he had, or, every time he, like I said, wet the bed or whatever it was?
Yeah, yes and no. And I think the other good thing about it too is that, like, I wasn't alone in that. Like, Dave and I are both now a united force with that. So I
Right.
had, like, it wasn't just me being like, am I being like overreactive? Am I just anxious about this because it's like my thing? Like, and he's way more like calm of a person than I am.
Yeah.
So it was helpful to have almost like a partner in this, and that we both know that this is a reality. And so it wasn't just me pushing for it, like he would do it too. I don't think we went overboard with it. But when we did do it, I felt more, again, like validated, like, okay, there's a reason I'm doing this. I'm not just like really, really nervous.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, I'm just thinking again, that I have to admit that I think for every type 1 parent, this is their worst nightmare.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to think of getting that information. And, like, was that something you constantly lived with? Like, this is my worst nightmare coming true? Or was it like, I got the information and now I'm going to, like, just deal with the next step?
I don't think I knew like what it was going to be when it happened. But when he did, and I was actually like, I'm a big runner. So I was on a run and I got a call from Dave saying, like, his blood sugar is like 250, you need to come home. It happened. It's happening.
Okay.
Right. And I think because I had dealt with all the emotions over, what was it, like a year and a half of leading up to that point, like I went into real tactical mode. Like I texted you and you were like, oh, it's 250. He's probably fine for the weekend. Cause I think, of course, it was like on a Friday night, right?
Yeah.
Like, when this happened. And then, I called I think I had the number of the study coordinator, because she was like, call me when it happens. And, she was kind of a
But I
lifeline.
mean, even just saying that, when it happens,
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
God, how foreboding is that, and it can become a little nebulous. Like, what does that exactly mean? Like you
Right.
said, was it happening when his blood sugars are 180 or 190 or
Right.
200? Like, what is that?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the positive of having this information, is that we're realizing that type 1 diabetes is a spectrum.
Yep.
That as soon as these antibodies became positive, he had type 1 diabetes. That autoimmune process is going on. And it just becomes, then when can his body not keep up? And there's not enough beta cells there, that becomes hyperglycemic. And even that can become nebulous. However, like, it's, I have to imagine that it's better to get it's happening when his blood sugar is 250 versus out of the blue in DKA.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's another big benefit, of that you were already vigilant, but you can be even more vigilant appropriately, I'm guessing.
Yeah. And I think it was confusing, right? Because it's not skyrocket off the charts,
Right.
like high, right? Like there's not even a reading. It's 250. So is this like an emergency? Do we need to go to the hospital now? Do we have time? Like, what do we do? So it still was a little bit like, I think we should do something.
Yeah.
But I was able to go into action mode instead of like have a meltdown. I think
Right.
that was the big important thing for me.
Well, I remember thinking about this when you texted me about this, like, his blood sugar is 250. And I was thinking, when I was diagnosed, and probably you, my blood sugar was probably 400 for like a month,
Yeah.
And so that's why I was like, you can wait till Monday. I hope that was good advice. You did okay. But, but it's just, we don't know,
We don't
like
know.
so when you went into tactical mode, what did that mean?
I called the study coordinator. I called his pediatrician. I was led down some like, well, you need to go to the ER. But then I found out that we could actually just go straight to the hospital and have a bed like reserved for us. So instead of like, I think it just, I was able to figure out through talking to different people how to expedite the process and get us like the care we needed without having to go through like wait in the emergency room for like who knows how long, half a day, right?
So then you mentioned that you've talked to other parents that have kids with type 1.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing these are parents that don't have type 1 mostly, or some of both.
Mostly, yeah.
How different do you think your journey, your experience was, where you have type 1A, you knew this information was coming for essentially years. And then when this happens, it's kind of a mildish case
Mm-hmm.
versus never maybe even hearing about type 1 diabetes and then probably like presenting in DKA. Like, I mean, do you have a sense of how different that was?
Well, it's interesting because when I meet parents with kids with type 1 diabetes, we don't talk as much about like the diagnosis story as we
Yeah.
do about like how do you do soccer?
Yeah.
how do you deal with the school?
Mhm.
Because that's a whole thing
Yeah.
that we, had to deal with. So it's really more like the living with diabetes and like the diagnosis story. But I can imagine one thing that's definitely different for me is that when we were going through the classic like diabetes 101, like we were teaching the aides or the educators things about diabetes that we had known. So it was kind of like when we were looking at our watches, like when can we get out of here? And we're leaving with a pump and a Dexcom, right? And they're like, "Whoa, you guys are like fast track. Like we have to go talk to the endocrinologist to make sure this is okay." And I'm like, "No, it's gonna be okay. Like we're not
Yeah.
doing MDI for 3 months before we get on a pump and
Yeah,
have
yeah.
a screaming child." Like he hated shots. So we fast tracked everything. And I don't think other parents would know those
Right.
options or have those options.
And have you ever wished that you didn't test his antibodies? That you had a couple years of ignorance is bliss?
No, because I was so prepped, I think, and ready when he did get, like, we didn't see that high blood sugar that I was able to, like, kind of compartmentalize a lot of my feelings because I already felt them,
Yeah.
right? And then just go into, like, okay, what are we going to do? How am I going to get him the best care? And I think if I hadn't known, I wouldn't have had that, like, clarity of mind to advocate for him like I did.
So then when you meet other type 1s that have kids or considering getting kids, what do you recommend? Like, I mean, I know this is a very personal
It is.
decision, but what do you say when they say, "Hey, Laura, what do you think? Should I screen my kids?"
I mean, I think the only thing I can do is tell them my story. And, it wasn't like a 100% yes, I wanted to do this. It was, I think this is probably going to be helpful. And then it sucked to get the data back. And then I went through my grief process with that, and learning about it. But then when he was diagnosed, I felt more prepared. So, but that doesn't mean that's the best decision for everybody,
Right.
right? Like, I don't think have you tested your
No,
kids?
we talked about this before too, that I feel I'm really conflicted by it because,
Yeah.
I have two small kids and I legitimately believe that everybody should have their kids screened. I think this is important for science. I think there's a lot of positive things going on in this area. It's relatively easy to get them screened, but I'm just not ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
My oldest, to be honest, like hates blood. And so honestly, it's still like the actual act of like getting him screened, even though it's like a finger stick is a barrier. And then having that information, I just don't know where I land on it right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I ultimately will, like, absolutely. It's just, it is a really personal choice. And you'd be like surprised. Like we actually had this one conference, a big TCYD conference years ago, and this topic came up and I basically said what I just said. And I felt like I was a little type 1 community shamed, like, how dare you? Like, you need to do this for science, so people have
No.
like really strong opinions about it. Um, and everyone just needs to come to their, like, get the information,
Yeah.
know the positives and negatives of knowing the information. I will say, however, that something that has changed in even the short term since your son was diagnosed is that now we're getting therapies that you can actually, or, potentially FDA approved to give people to delay the onset of type 1 diabetes, which is something we have never been able to say in the history of type 1
It's
diabetes.
amazing.
That now, we're at the, cusp of actually having medications that people can get that have been proven now to delay the onset of 2 or 3 years. So this is moving out of the realm of like, I should just test because I want to know, to yes, I want to test, I want to know, I want to prepare myself, and there's potentially something I can do about it. And that and is
That's a
huge.
big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So give us a little update on how he's doing now, what life is like as a type 1 mom.
Mm-hmm.
Your interactions with him, in terms around type 1 diabetes, I guess. That's something I don't have an experience with.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because you've had the comparison to like parents who have children with type 1 diabetes and then versus like me and Dave. Like, I think I'm more relaxed
Yeah.
than the parents that don't have diabetes themselves. Cause, like, God, I survived the 90s
Right.
and not having pumps or CGM with diabetes and didn't have perfect control. And that does not mean like Mason has good control. And his numbers are fine, right? Whenever we go to the endo, like they're cool with it. But I don't overstress because I think like going back to when I was a kid, there was such a, like I had the log book with like the pen that had the 3 different colors, red, blue, and black. Do you remember those like old school pens where
Oh,
you had
yeah.
to click
I'm
down?
thinking insulin pen. You mean
Oh,
an
no,
actual
like
pen?
an actual, not an insulin
Yeah.
pen.
Yeah.
And like I had a logbook and all the numbers in high that were high or low were like in red.
Oh
And
my
I would have
gosh.
such anxiety going to my doctor to be like, here's my report card of how I am doing as a human being trying to manage this chronic disease. Right. And so like, I don't want him like, and even back then, like, numbers are just numbers. Like that wasn't like that. Like there was good and there was bad. Like there was good food and bad food and good numbers and bad numbers and all of that. And I try really, really, really hard to help him live the most normal life that he can within reason, right? Like if he's 300 and he wants like a high sugary or high carb snack, like we talk about it and we're like, now is not really the best time for that. Like nothing wrong with the food, but let's like give some insulin and then we'll wait. Do you want something else instead now? And then later we'll revisit it, like trying to make it age appropriate because he's 6 and that's hard, but also,
So tell me though,
yeah.
like about, again, kind of in the Mother's Day vein, you had your
Yeah.
mom, dietitian, doing her best to keep you under control. What lessons have you taken from her that you are either trying your hardest not to do or emulating? You have lived this life as a kid with type 1. Like, so how are you bringing that forward to, helping him?
Yeah. So it's Mother's Day vein. Let's start with the positive things to honor my mother. I think she tried really hard to make sure that my life could be as normal as possible. So I've always been a really competitive athlete. And so I did like competitive dance as a kid or competitive swimming. And she always worked really hard with my endocrinologist and then, looking at like different foods that I could eat to help me succeed at those types of things, right? Rather than not being in active sports, right?
Okay.
So we worked hard on that. But I think because of that, because she's a dietitian, there was like a very, very big focus on food and portions. And I never really learned any like intuitive eating because I just ate to my insulin spikes. And so that led to a lot of disordered eating behaviors and thoughts and totally, separate topic. But I'm very mindful of that right now with my son because I want food to just be food, right? And we do have to talk about carbs because I want him to understand like, not just like carbs for diabetes sake, but, balanced meals. And so really when we talk about that kind of stuff. It's more about just overall healthy eating with diabetes like on the side and like
Right.
how we do that. Um
Which,
and like
you're being very elegant about this, but I'm just imagining with my 6.5-year-old, who's just, mac and cheese and, chicken nuggets. And like, that's a tough conversation to have with a
it
6-year-old
is.
in general.
It is.
And then, you got to layer on this, like, the insulin and all that. So
Yeah.
it's tough. Yeah.
And I think too, like we're mindful about like what we buy, like the little Trader Joe's mini ice cream cones. He'll be like, "Hey mom, I'm having one that's 10 carbs. Can you bolus me?" Like it's cute. So like he's kind of gets engaged and, sight changes like we talked about are tough, but he'll do this thing where like, we'll put, the adhesive on and then he'll look at me and be like, he'll hold his hand or hold my hand and say, "Mommy, I need a couple seconds. I need to be brave." And so like we wait and we like, instead of forcing through all these moments and just being busy, busy, busy all the time, like it's his body. It hurts. It sucks as a kid. So like really celebrating him being brave and I don't know. It's like, it's also our thing. So the fact that both of his parents have it, like he sees us doing it.
I'm almost like imagining you guys syncing up Dexcom changes or site changes.
No, we don't do that. We don't do that. No.
It's like
but I will show him.
pump change day.
And there have been times where I will let him like push the little trigger on the Dexcom to let it go in and whatnot. Or like, the other thing too is like when he feels upset about something, like that one really hurt. Like, just I get it. Yeah,
Right.
they hurt, and I really get it. So I think, back to like the benefit of him having parents who truly understand. I don't try to sugarcoat it. I don't try to be like, it's okay, it'll stop hurting soon. I'm more like, yeah, they hurt sometimes.
Yeah.
That's hard.
And it's interesting here you say that you're potentially more relaxed than like, somebody without
think
type
so.
1. And I have to remember that, when I was still in my training as a fellow, but I kind of, I did a diabetes camp and my job was like oversee the kids' blood sugars, like whatever. And so here I am, a type 1 diabetes like endocrinologist. And at the end of the day, the parents would come and look at their blood sugars for the day and they would just rake me over the coals.
Ooh.
Like, why were they 230 after lunch? I'm like, I don't know. Like,
'Cause
you
they
had like
ate.
some juice, like, it's just being a kid. So I was like, I felt like, I had that kind of perspective, like it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
But there can be this real goal for, perfection, which I understand. You want your kid to be healthy, but it's finding that balance. And you're right. Like, I think the fact that we survived, I don't know how I did college on regular
Oh my
NPH,
God, I know,
Dexcom
right?
and all that. And you have to feel like if we can do that, then with all the tools and things that we have today, that they're going to be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I have that. This reminded me though, like when he does have to do a finger poke, because I think the Dexcom's inaccurate or it's in an error. I'm like, back in my day, I had to do this 5 times. So just like toughen up, you know?
It's like,
So there's
whatever,
that
Mom.
too.
Yeah. That's
Up,
awesome.
up the hill both ways. Finger sticks.
Yeah. So, maybe leaving people with some just like, I don't know, any words of encouragement or things that you think are so apparent that maybe have changed since, when you were a child to now today, or, maybe with this like screening process or any just kind of take home points that you want to leave people with.
Yeah, I'm most excited about where we're going with all the automated insulin delivery systems and all the different choices that people are having. I'm like crossing my fingers for when the Omnipod 5 goes to like the mass public, because that's my son's not on automated insulin yet, and I think that's going to be a huge game changer. But I think the advancements in technology are amazing, and what makes me most excited for him to grow up is to not have to spend so much of his mental energy like looking at his blood sugars all the time or thinking about highs and lows, and having sensors and pumps that can do a lot of it behind the scenes and you engage minimally. I know that's not all the time, but like that's my hope.
Well, it's, as you're talking, I can't help it. Like our next TCOID conference is coming up June 18th. And the theme is like the future of diabetes is now. And as I'm hearing you talk, I mean, can you imagine if you went back and told you as a 5-year-old kid that, you're wanting the Omnipod 5 for your son, that there's going to be this little pod that you can wear on your arm that like, does insulin delivery based on this other thing that you wear that automatically tells you what your blood sugar. I mean, it sounds like the future. And it's something that we really are living now. And it doesn't mean it's fun.
No.
Still got to wear a pump and but like the advancements that have happened in like a relatively short time are encouraging. And so, I don't have your history with, one of my sons being diagnosed, but I have to believe that it's so much better now. And that, they're going to live a long and healthy life and potentially be better human beings and, have more empathy because of it.
Yeah.
So do you think about that ever as a gift that type 1 diabetes is giving, or is that too much?
I've always and this, goes back to how I met my husband. I think type 1 diabetes has given me a lot of scars in a lot of ways when you think of the responsibility or all of that it can put on you. And in a lot of ways, people think that's a good thing, but it can also lead to not so good things. I have met so many wonderful people because of my type 1 diabetes. I think the relationships that I've built because of that are the ones that I wouldn't give up for the world. And so, I'm excited for him to go to diabetes camp. And maybe it is that shared empathy that we have for people who are dealing with something that, you can't go into remission from or you can't beat, right? It's always with you and you have highs and lows along the way. But I'm excited for him to meet those people and really have his own community too. With COVID, he hasn't really seen and met a lot of that. And there was a little kid on his soccer team who the mom and I were both excited that, they're going to be besties because they both have diabetes. They didn't care. But I think
well, that's kind of best case scenario,
maybe,
right?
Maybe.
It's not like I have this huge wound that I need to find somebody else.
Maybe
it's
that's
just
the new normal. It's cool.
Yeah.
No, but I think but there is something special about a camp for kids with diabetes.
Well, I was thinking,
a little different too.
Again, before we got this started, of how I met you and how I know you, and we're friends, right, Laura?
Yeah.
But it was it's just kind of I met you and you had type 1 and we were just friends.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of how that works.
Right.
So there's definitely some positives of having that community. Maybe he's not friends with this guy now, but maybe he will be.
Give it some time.
Yeah. Maybe leave us with how's he doing? How are you, you kind of said your hope for the future, but just, I don't know, kind of find him.
He's great. He's a 6.5-year-old, who loves Sonic the Hedgehog, who's doing T-ball, who is also in jujitsu, and just I don't know, he's just a kid who happens to have diabetes, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and the sky is the limit. I'm constantly telling people that, I see with type 1 diabetes, you're going to live a long and healthy life, and you're going to die of something else. How lucky are we going to be to die because we got hit by a bus? What I mean is diabetes,
It's really morbid.
Diabetes isn't going to be the thing, and we just we can perseverate on that. And I think there are some real strengths that come from this. So I think, thank you for telling us your story. I mean, there's so much there that we could talk, for
Days.
so long about. But again, I think, with this screening thing, this type1tested.com, if anybody's interested, this becomes so much easier to do. There's, therapies on the horizon that we can actually do. And I think, honestly, in 5-10 years from now, we're going to have multiple therapies. And I think this will become kind of part of routine pediatric care, is that we're just, instead of your story where you had to go out and just find people to get screening, it will just be kind of the norm, just like we test for cystic fibrosis or other kind of things. And then options, available to ideally prevent it entirely. And that's really, a part of the quote unquote cure is just not getting it in the freaking first place. And we're on that road. So I think even in the short term that, we're talking about with the last couple of years, things have changed and it'll continue to improve. And I'm glad you're doing well. Mason's doing well. And I just think that your story is really inspiring, and thank you for being here.
Thank
and
you.
Happy Mother's Day.
I was just going to say, and everyone out there, go hug your mom or a mom or, yeah.
Yeah. So stay tuned for a Father's Day special, which is not happening. It's all about mothers. So, all right. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.